OpenClaw has taken the world by storm, but Agent Zero is not forgotten. Agent Zero is still one of the most autonomous AI agent frameworks out there, and in this video I'm going to explain to you the difference between the two and why you might want to use one or the other. There are three main distinctions between the two projects that I'm going to cover in this video. And point number 3 is going to be something I imagine 90% of you have not thought about at all, so I encourage you to pay attention to the end because it is a very important factor to consider in the future of open source autonomous agent frameworks. By the end, you will have a great idea of why OpenClaw differs from Agent Zero and the strengths and weaknesses of both. So the first thing to cover real quick is the autonomy spectrum. Most AI tools as we've known them for the last couple years are reactive, but autonomous agents flip that because they're active. So level 0 to 1 is they just take a prompt. They don't have memory. They start from scratch every time. Then level 1, they've got maybe a ClaudMD context file. Level 2 to 3, they get more skills and repeatable commands. So they have workflows that they can run without you having to explain it every time. And then levels 4 to 5 are multi-agent harnesses. They're whole teams that do stuff, and they have quality assurance agents that review things. And they essentially have full autonomy as much as you give it. You can decide how much or little human in the loop that you want to be. So that's the autonomy spectrum here. OpenClaw, Agent Zero are both in level 5. Super autonomous, super powerful for their own reasons. So as a brief introduction, in case you've been living under a rock, OpenClaw is the viral sensation that can basically go out into the world and do things for you. Now, the world, I mean internet, but it's very proactive. It has this heartbeat, which wakes it up and says, hey, it's time to do whatever's in the memory, whatever's in the context. Meanwhile, Agent Zero is the quiet builder. Agent Zero never went viral, but it's a very powerful system that's fully contained in its own little Docker environment on its own operating system. And we're going to keep talking about all of these things, but if there were to be just one key feature for each of these frameworks that make it stand out, my opinion is that OpenClaw has its heartbeat system that wakes it up to go do things proactively, while Agent Zero does hierarchical organization and orchestration of sub-agents in a really cool and unique and effective way. So OpenClaw goes and does things out in the world. Agent Zero gets complex, deep work done really well. They're both open source, MIT licensed, very permissive, meaning you can create full businesses off of these open source frameworks, and we will discuss that more later. Okay, I'll be real with you. I've been wanting to make this video for a while, for a few weeks at least. I've been using Agent Zero for about 6 months. I've been using OpenClaw for, I don't know, a month. And I put together this whole presentation. I was getting everything ready to really demonstrate the architecture differences and explain everything to you. But then I just decided to say, hey, Agent Zero, research OpenClaw and compare its architecture and functionality to yourself. So in the spirit of doing the OpenClaw versus Agent Zero comparison, I'm just going to show you the difference between the two. The first thing I want to show you is that when I told Agent Zero to do some research, that's what it did. Okay? It uses its web tool, uses the search engine to do a bunch of research and use some tools, and it figured out what OpenClaw was and it compared it to Agent Zero. So here's the architectural comparison. We'll start with this. Now, I'll be real with you. This core architecture stuff is beyond what I really want to talk about. Yes, OpenClaw uses Node.js, has 430,000 lines of code. Agent Zero runs on Python on its own Linux operating system inside a Docker container. So both of them have their own respective levels of freedom to do things and execute on their own. But the big key difference here is OpenClaw's centralized gateway. Everything passes through one Node.js process. Agent Zero, though, is more distributed. Basically, the whole point of Agent Zero is that Agent Zero is the zero agent, and it can spawn Agent 1, Agent 2, Agent 3, Agent 4. It can keep spawning agents that report back to Agent Zero to save on context and to actually just work faster too. And if you've used Agent Zero, you know what I'm talking about here. Okay, so let's talk about the memory systems for a bit. Now, this is not one of the big 3 things that I mentioned that we're going to cover in this video, but this gets an honorable mention because it's a really big deal. Agent Zero does semantic memory, meaning this memory dashboard is searched by meaning, whereas OpenClaw searches by literal text matching. Now, if that's wrong, leave a comment and let me know. But I did do a fair bit of research on this, and as a non-technical person, that ended up being the conclusion I found. But the example here is like, what did we discuss about deployment? And Agent Zero can find that even if deployment never actually appears. And so I don't have it on screen to show you right now, but in my experience, once again, about 6 months using Agent Zero, it does a really good job at that. Whereas my OpenClaw sometimes doesn't even remember that it was just restarted while we were changing something in the config. But I would say this is actually a really big deal in distinguishing the two frameworks. So Agent Zero has a database, but OpenClaw has 9 core markdown files that it uses for its memory. I'm going to show you the 7 core files here. SoulMD, which is its personality, behavioral rules, its philosophy. AgentsMD for its operating instructions. HeartbeatMD for its checklist of what to do when it wakes up every 30 minutes. ToolsMD, tools. Identity, user, your preferences. And the Bootstrap first-time interview where you tell it what you want. Meanwhile, Agent Zero's memory is in a database that you can see in the dashboard here. Fragments, solutions. It keeps all its memories in here so the agent knows how to find it when it needs it. Even with projects, you have a project, you give it instructions, you give it knowledge, and you give it secrets, and you give it skills. And those projects can be separated. So in each conversation, you can be in a different project. With OpenClaw, everything is logged in plain markdown files. And generally speaking, you don't get the full history loaded when you're talking to OpenClaw. You just get the recent, yesterday, today memories. So OpenClaw's daily log partitions is clever. It's a good way to optimize the context window in every conversation so you don't run out of tokens before any work gets done. But Agent Zero actually gives the agent, Agent Zero, direct control over what gets loaded. Now, I'm not a tech guy. I can't exactly explain that to you, but you can actually see it all here, how it works. I can open up every memory where it sees, oh, there was a problem here, and here's the solution. And it tells you all this here, all this metadata. And so it's all in there somewhere, and it knows how to query it and find it when it comes up in a conversation. And you'll see pages and pages of these will eventually load in your memory dashboard. That's what's really cool about Agent Zero is its persistent memory. Okay, so let's talk about tools. OpenClaw has all these built-in tools, pretty standard, web search, code execution, read files, etc. And then meanwhile, Agent Zero has its own terminal, has its own operating system. It runs everything through Python, but it can execute Node.js. It has a browser. It does document query, web search, vision, memory schedule, and it's got agent-to-agent chat, which is cool. And you can actually connect this to OpenClaw. You can say, hey, use Agent Zero when you need to spawn sub-agents, and OpenClaw will do that. And it's actually pretty cool. Both of them use Playwright for browser automation, but you can also teach them both skills like Camafox that do better than Playwright and get the job done better. Now, one thing that OpenClaw does excel at is self-improvement. It will write, test, validate, and register new skills autonomously. Agent Zero, you kind of got to prompt it to do that or run the wizard or upload skills. But the truth is with both of them, you're going to have to tell it like, hey, we learned something. Make sure you update your files so next time the issues don't happen again. Okay, so let's talk about the multi-agent architecture. OpenClaw by default is single agent, and Agent Zero is a hierarchical multi-agent orchestrator. That is one of the 3 main differences that distinguish Agent Zero and OpenClaw, and we're going to get to the other 2 soon. But basically what this means is that Agent Zero is just Agent Zero, and it spawns more agents when it needs work done so it can save on context, and it's really good at that. That's what it excels at. If we go to the settings here, you can see right out the gate that it already has a bunch of different profiles for different agents that it can call when it needs one of these. And you can create as many as you want. I want a content creator agent. I want a whatever agent. It can make agents for you with their own knowledge directories, with their own skills, tools, whatever. And it will call those agents when it needs them. So here's another deep research report that I had done on the 2 frameworks. And one thing I think is really important to note is that there's a lot that can be compared between all these frameworks that might not be as important to you depending on you and what you're doing and who you are using AI. So for example, I'm a solopreneur, I'm a creator, I'm not exactly an engineer, right? So the way I interpret what all this functionality does in a framework is very different than an engineer, for example. And so in my Autonomous Agent AI framework videos, subscribe for more, you'll see that I'm really just looking at these as like, okay, how can these help me? So in this other deep research report I also had done by a Claude Code harness, we'll see that the technology itself interprets the frameworks in a different way than just a human user experience would. So for example, the semantic memory feature of Agent Zero is really important to an AI and distinguishing the differences between the two frameworks. For me, however, this deep hierarchical orchestration is a lot more important. Even though we see it might not be as dramatic as a gap here, both OpenClaw and Agent Zero can do orchestrations with subagents, and you can even choose in OpenClaw to allow there to be multiple levels of subagents, which means subagents can spawn subagents, which can spawn subagents, blah, blah, blah. Agent Zero does that natively, and the results really demonstrate that. OpenClaw, it's a little bit of like, it's a little more tricky. You got to do workarounds. And I haven't had personally great results with sub-agent flows inside of OpenClaw. One thing I do agree with the AI report on is the skill marketplace. Agent Zero does not have that type of community yet. That said, that skill marketplace has also become a bit of a dangerous place. So do your due diligence before using that. And let's take a look at the architecture in a simplified way of looking at this. OpenClaw is a Node.js process with a single context window that saves its memory in markdown files. That's the basic architecture here. Agent Zero is not living on the host machine, meanwhile. It's living in a Docker container, Python runtime, with its whole Agent Zero thing. So it's got its Agent Zero window, and then it spawns all the different agents it needs. And that's really what it's named after that. Agent Zero is for multi-agent orchestration. I can't stress that enough. So that is the number one big difference in these two frameworks. Agent Zero is meant for multiple agents, spawning their own agents to do better work. And that will lead us into our later main points of why you might choose Agent Zero over OpenClaw. And then meanwhile, of course, Agent Zero uses a different type of memory completely. So the first big point here is Agent Zero's deep hierarchical orchestration of agents. Both agents can do multi-agent, but the depth is different. And I'm not about to try to explain the little details. And who knows, by the time you watch this video, maybe OpenClaw, its whole framework has changed. But at the time of recording this, Agent Zero is meant for complex, deep work. That's what its orchestration is all about. But the main point here I want to say, without saying something that someone in the comments is going to say, no, that's wrong, is the prompt profile. Remember, Agent Zero has all these multiple prompt profiles, and so every subagent can have its own profile. OpenClaw has a single identity, soul.md, which essentially with the bootstrap MD that you fill out in the very beginning, it asks you, hey, who am I? What do I do? It creates these identity files, and that's it. One Raspberry Pi is one OpenClaw. That's it. One machine, one OpenClaw. But with Agent Zero, you have a prompt profile per agent, which is what I just showed you. So you can make as many agents as you need. You can set anyone to be default if you want. So you have a lot more flexibility with who these agents are and what they do well. OpenClaw does give you different workspaces, which has their own memory and tool use for the agent. But Agent Zero, especially with the projects feature, basically allow you to separate the context. So when you're in one project, that's it. All the context inside here, from the instructions to the knowledge base, the memory, the skills, everything is just limited to that one project. Very similar to a workspace idea. And the tools are shared across agents, across projects. Meanwhile, of course, you can use any LLM provider with both Agent Zero and OpenClaw. As we see here, there's all these different providers here, and you can choose whichever model. Same thing with OpenClaw. So the real big difference here is that Agent Zero is multi-agent by default, and it excels at that. OpenClaw doesn't really do that by default, at least not super well, so you have to get creative and make some workarounds to get these sub-agents spawned efficiently. And I also think this agent identity thing is really important. Having a prompt profile per agent is very helpful if you have used sub-agents before, like with Cloud Code. And the fact that you can't really do that inside OpenClaw, once again, at least not by default, that is kind of a big bummer. But really what this means is that in the Agent Zero interface, I can work on plenty of things in new conversations, new projects, essentially at the same time. But with OpenClaw, when I want to do something, it's basically one task at a time, and then it catches up on any new prompts. There could be some serious context window issues, and so it does get stuff done, but it's basically like I need one OpenClaw instance for one job. And if I want to have a team, I need to have multiple OpenClaws installed, running, active. Okay, let's talk about skills. Agent Zero was somewhat late to the game with skills, but you can load them in as global or project specific. You can have skills that all your projects, all your agents know, or you can load them into projects specifically. So you know, oh, I'm working on a marketing project and it has all these marketing skills right there. Claw Hub is pretty cool if you're careful and you make sure it's safe. because it's a registry that's built into OpenClaw to find new skills. It is much more manual with Agent Zero, even though they're all cross-agent compatible. OpenClaw excels at making its own new skills autonomously, even though you might have to nudge it a little bit. Agent Zero also does that, but you do need to run this like create skill wizard. Let's see. Now you can see it just loaded the wizard to create a skill. What should it be called? What problem does it solve? When should it activate? Does it need any supporting files? So yes, it's not completely autonomous, but it is pretty easy. Okay, so next is the second big distinguishing point, scheduling and proactive behavior. OpenClaw is the heartbeat system. It will wake up every 30 minutes or hour, whenever you tell it to, and it will do the thing that you ask it to do. It will do the task. It's proactive and time triggered. Meanwhile, Agent Zero does have a task scheduler right here, and you can have it do tasks, like do it at every time. Here's the problem. I've never gotten it to work. And I love the idea of it, and I have my Docker container with Agent Zero running all the time, but I've actually never been able to get these tasks to work. So maybe that's changed in a new version. For now, I don't actually trust it to get stuff done. To my knowledge, it won't open up a new conversation either. So perhaps it will do something, but say it needs to get input from me. That isn't going to work as smoothly with Agent Zero as it is with OpenClaw. OpenClaw will straight up run my X digest every morning like I ask it and give me summaries of what's going on in the AI space. I have not had any issues with the heartbeat with OpenClaw, and that is a very, very, very important distinguishing factor. Huge. And so that is OpenClaw's heartbeat. It's an interval-based trigger, which means it just happens every, 30 minutes. Whereas Agent Zero, it's scheduled, plans, or ad hoc, meaning it has to be like, okay, exact time. So my conclusion on this is that I think as a non-engineer developer type, OpenClaw is definitely better. But if you are more well-versed in cron jobs and all that, and you're doing more like maybe system administrator stuff, Agent Zero is better. And if you have some information on that, leave it in a comment, because I just haven't been able to get tasks to work in Agent Zero, and I would like to. So if you see this video and you're good at Agent Zero, let us know in the comments. Thank you. So I'm going to skip the code execution section here. The main thing to know is that you kind of have no choice but to run Agent Zero in Docker. I mean, I'm sure you can do it outside of Docker, but Docker is like the best way to run it because you're installing an operating system. So that's why Agent Zero just gets things done, because it doesn't have to ask permissions. It just goes for it. Meanwhile, the way OpenClaw works, you're going to want to use it on its own machine, even more so than just using a Docker container, especially if it's using heartbeats and using skills and connecting to ClawHub and Moltbook or whatever. Like, there's a lot of stuff out there that could be potentially dangerous, so you want to be running on its own machine, and it'll run code and stuff in that environment. And so you want to keep that in mind when you think about your AI agent running code, running terminal commands. How much access to important stuff does it have? Okay, LLMs and deployment. This is pretty easy. Both of them, you can use pretty much whatever model, whatever provider you want. They both technically support Ollama for local models. I've never gotten it to work with Agent Zero. Maybe my computer is just not powerful enough. But I have gotten Ollama to work with OpenClaw, no problem. Once again, if you have any notes on that, let me know. I know most people have problems with Ollama and Agent Zero. Another thing to keep in mind is Agent Zero gives you an interface here, right? And like I showed you the memories earlier, you have different chats, you can see the cron job. Meanwhile, OpenClaw is just a chat interface. But really, when you want to make changes to OpenClaw, you got to go in through SSH, go into the files, or go onto that actual computer and mess around with it. But with Agent Zero, it's all here for you. So when you need to make a change to the settings or install a skill or whatever, it's all here. Now, security. You probably have heard of OpenClaw's security issues and vulnerabilities. Agent Zero just makes this a lot simpler because it runs in its own container. Prompt injection is mitigated by structured JSON tool architecture. Not quite exactly sure what that means, but I've never heard of any security issues with Agent Zero. Have you? OpenClaw, there's nothing but security issues that everyone's talking about. Okay, so in summary, OpenClaw has any interface you want, essentially. Agent Zero has a web UI. They both have a unique memory architecture, but when it comes to using multi-agents, Agent Zero takes the cake. According to Agent Zero, its full task management system is better than OpenClaw's Heartbeat, but once again, you're going to have to be a better user than I to get it working. OpenClaw by default has more self-improvement baked in. In my experience, I've still had to tell it to do a lot of its own self-improvement, but apparently it's more baked into the base functionality. Agent Zero with its own operating system has a better job with code execution control. They both are completely flexible with LLMs and providers. OpenClaw is technically more simple to deploy as a single Node.js process, while Agent Zero needs a whole operating system. And yes, even though I haven't heard of any Agent Zero security issues, both do carry meaningful risk. A Docker container does not mean fully safe and secure on your main machine. So the last little point here in Agent Zero's report, OpenClaw thinks like a digital worker connected to the world, so it keeps doing stuff. Agent Zero is more like a organization that gets its team ready to do big, more complex tasks. That's how I like to think about it, is OpenClaw is the agent that does things for you in the world. Agent Zero is like the office, the headquarters to get the like real, deep, complex work done. Now, before I tell you my third and most final and perhaps most important point in the Agent Zero versus OpenClaw debate, let's look at what Agent Zero thinks is better. It depends on what you're building. Yes, exactly. OpenClaw is your always-on personal assistant. It will write its own skills when it encounters problems, and you could use it for like a consumer-facing chatbot. Meanwhile, Agent Zero is great for orchestrating complex multi-agent pipelines, run deep code execution tasks, and building enterprise workflows. And this has been my conclusion as well. Use Agent Zero for the deep, complex work. Use OpenClaw to go out there and just do the little menial daily tasks. In a future video, I am going to show you my stack with what I use Agent Zero for versus OpenClaw, and I'll demonstrate each agent. I use about 6 or 7 in my daily workflow, so hit that subscribe button if you want to be notified when that video comes out. It's going to be pretty neat. Okay, big point number 3 that I want to bring up. Really important, perhaps the most important, depending on your use cases. But everything here is open source software, MIT licensed, which means super permissive, which means with both OpenClaw and Agent Zero, you could build a whole business off of this infrastructure. The license allows you to do that, as long as you leave this license in saying, hey, this is where I got it from. So this means that the future development of these projects is actually really important. Even if you're not building an actual business, but maybe you're using these agents to like do things for you for your business. I mean, you're going to be dependent on these frameworks in some way, shape, or form if you're using them a lot. So OpenClaw went so viral, it broke 200,000, I think it broke 100,000 stars faster than any other repo ever. Right now it's at 232,000 stars. Agent Zero has only got 15,000 stars because it hasn't had any viral marketing campaigns. And as we're all aware, it was so viral that Sam Altman basically hired Peter Steinberger. He brought him on to OpenAI. Now, this doesn't mean that OpenAI bought OpenClaw. In fact, if anything, it means that it's going to become, OpenClaw is going to become more like the Linux Foundation, where OpenAI becomes one of the main corporate sponsors. As you see here, the Linux Foundation's funding model is driven by corporate membership dues, which account for $133 million in 2025. That's crazy. But the point is that this open source software acts as the backbones for, hey, a bunch of corporations. So if OpenClaw becomes more enterprise ready, OpenAI is going to be like, hey, yes, we want to make sure we fund this project. And yeah, coincidence, Peter Steinberger is also working for us. But that will make sure that OpenAI's interests are represented by the OpenClaw development. You see where this is going? So this has been announced. I don't believe there's any details yet as of now, late February 2026, but this is where it's going. OpenClaw is becoming a foundation. And yes, 100%, I believe we have the right to be concerned because, hey, it's OpenAI, but we have no idea what's going to happen. So that is a traditional open source funding model. Put a pin in that. Because next, let's talk about Agent Zero and how its governance works. Now, as you might or might not be aware, Agent Zero has this token. So why would any kind of project, an open source project, create a token? Well, in theory, it's very simple. The reason there would be a token is the same reason the Linux Foundation would accept donations. If you are contributing, you get a voice. So if you are staking enough tokens, you get a voice. So if you're building a business with one of these frameworks and it's making a ton of money, you probably want to have a voice in the direction of the development of the project. So this is why the Linux Foundation works the way it does. This is why Agent Zero has a token. So it's the same kind of concept, but just a different way of executing. So by owning the token and staking it, like these people on the leaderboard, then theoretically you get more voting power on the proposals. Now look, they're upgrading the proposal system. I know for a fact that there have been proposals. I've seen them. They're just currently down. But that's not what I wanted to bring up here, because it's down, but big decisions are still being made without the actual voting, which may or may not be of concern to you if you are a token holder because you want a voice in the project. A couple months ago, there was a big proposal by Agent Zero to acquire the YouTuber David Andre and his startup Vectel. And if you watch this video on his channel, he mentions how he sold his AI startup for $1.8 million. That was more or less given to him in the form of token equity by Agent Zero, and he became the CEO of Agent Zero. Now here on the Agent Zero school community, they announced that this was going to be a proposal, but meanwhile, it wasn't. It was simply announced by him on his channel he has a ton of subscribers, he makes valuable content, people trust him, and then they just published the video and there was never actually a proposal. In fact, I voiced my own concerns in here as well, some other people did as well, but no one knows the details of that. The whole point of this was David Andre selling his company to Agent Zero, and he would also become the CEO of Agent Zero to help out Jan, the CTO, so he could stay focused. In essence, the whole thing makes a lot of sense, but to my knowledge, the vote never happened. There was an announcement about a vote, but then an announcement that had already happened, and now he's just CEO. So the whole thing was weird in my opinion, because it looked like there was going to be transparency, but then there wasn't transparency. I don't know. I don't really get it. That's not the point. The point is, this is a different governance model that is much less proven, that carries with it a different type of risk. This is a governance model for the individual, peer-to-peer, instead of corporate membership dues like OpenAI sponsoring the new OpenClaw Foundation or whatever happens there. I would say the big takeaway of the Agent Zero token proposal community situation is that the average person like you and me can have a voice in the development. But in actual execution, at the end of the day, the organization and the creators, developers are going to do what they will. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. They're the ones doing all the work. It's their baby more than it is ours just because we're using it. So this is something to think about. And don't get me wrong here. I love the Agent Zero team. I love the guys. They're working really hard. Here in their school, they're always pushing new stuff. These guys are working hard and they're making a great project. So I don't want to take anything away from them, nor do I want to accuse them of being dishonest. So this is just the nature of the governance models here. And OpenClaw with OpenAI could potentially also be a little bit concerning, but time will tell with that. Everyone's pretty stoked on OpenClaw. I don't see why OpenAI would want to do anything to jeopardize that, but who knows what can happen? No one knows what can happen. But that's why point number 3 is governance. These two projects are governed very differently, and it's really important to keep in mind, especially if you're going to build a business on top of this infrastructure. So my conclusion in mentioning the governance is that, hey, if you're going to take any of these agent frameworks seriously, know how they're governed as big open source projects, because one day it could affect you deeper than you think, even if right now you're just messing around with stuff. My personal opinion is pay attention to the work. What is being shipped? If that's cool, good. Trust is probably the most important factor in all of this. So as long as you can trust that this project is going to continue in the direction that its founders are saying it will, then cool, go for it. But just be aware that as open source projects get big, governance becomes a factor. So these are the 3 main points. Number 1 is the difference between how these two frameworks execute multi-agent coordination. Agent Zero goes much deeper and it's much more efficient for complex work. Then you have the actual type of work environment. OpenClaw is the agent that goes out there into the world, while Agent Zero is the headquarters for deep, complex work. Huge, huge distinction in why you would use OpenClaw versus Agent Zero. They can be very complementary in that sense. And then finally, governance. Most of us don't think about this at all, and that's cool. Hopefully I've put it on your radar, but it's something to think about for the future of open source software and how you use it. So thanks for watching. I hope this was helpful. I'm a big fan of both of these projects. I love Agent Zero. I really do. And while I wouldn't say I love OpenClaw, I do really like it. I think it's a powerful tool, especially when you get it set up right. And this is also just going to depend on what you do. You might not need OpenClaw. You might not need Agent Zero, but they both can be helpful for your stack. So thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. Check out the AI Captain School if you want to learn with me personally, if you want to be part of a community of builders that talk about all this stuff. See ya.